Thanks for being here, Professor Hall. And I wanted to begin by asking you about just talking about why you wrote this book and why you thought it was necessary.
I wrote A Reforming People because I thought there wasn't anything quite like it, in the sense that people were dividing religion from society, religion from social history, and then there's a second reason for writing it, and that is political history has been neglected. Mm-hmm. So I had a broad aim, which was to link the religious and the social, mm-hmm. And then I had the glimmerings of this argument that began to form, how daring the communists were. And then as I said to myself, my goodness, this has been unplowed ground for a very long time. I should say a third thing that happened is that I had a fellowship, a year's leave, to begin the research with a really very vague sense of what I was going to do. And so I did what is often characteristic of me. I just opened up town records, I opened up church records in print at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester. And I remember the shock of reading the Denham records, which I'd actually read many, many years ago, but with a different purpose in mind, and just how much ethical language infused the everyday political and economic practices of this town. And I thought, I didn't know that. And if I didn't know that, lots of other people don't know that. So one has to, as a historian, always remember that there are these sources out there, and you're supposed to learn from them or relearn from them.
So much of your book is taking on misconceptions about the Puritans and kind of the stereotypes that people carry. And one of the most enduring stereotypes is that New England was a theocracy, ruled by the clergy. Is that correct, or how would you describe it?
Well, it's absolutely wrong that the clergy have political power. First of all, there was a standing rule that they couldn't hold political office. I went to the Cambridge Town Records to see how often Thomas Shepard, who was the minister, was mentioned. And was he there at town meetings? Was he sticking his nose into affairs? Even with this rule, you could still presumably stick your nose into affairs. And in these very, very dense, thick, with hundreds of names, hundreds of people turning up again and again, he is mentioned twice, only in reference to land grants that were made to him. So then also in Cambridge, it's interesting, this is true in other towns as well, the deacons of the church never held selectman office or constable office, and they observed this very, very strictly. So there was a very strong sense that the church had to be free from civil or secular power, and the civil had to be also free the other way around. And this is a fundamental principle of Calvinism and the Reformed tradition. The term theocracy is occasionally used by the colonists themselves. Mm-hmm. What they mean by it is righteousness prevailing, that we're going to be a righteous society. That's what a theocracy means. It means God is in charge. Mm-hmm. The only other qualification would be that the ministers did feel they could speak to social questions. They were unabashedly vocal about people getting out of line morally, that sort of thing. So, they're not quiet, they're not quiescent people, they're very outspoken about values. And those values, of course, impinged on what the John governments did in certain ways. Political power, no. Political rule, absolutely not. Speaking to issues, yes. Speaking to some issues very strongly, yes. Overall sense of God's in charge, yes. So that's a theocracy, but not in the operational sense.
That's really interesting. Now, a moment ago, you brought up Calvinism, mm-hmm. which is one of those other terms that is always applied to the Puritans, and with the sense that Calvinism was gloomy and repressive, and kind of the reason why they always dressed in black and were so unhappy. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about that too.
Well, Calvinism labors under a huge cloud. Ironically, in our country today, there are many, many people proud to call themselves Calvinists who are not gloomy and black and so forth and so on. The great excuse for this stereotype really is the notion that we are predestined, and so God was a very judging, vengeful God who said, off with you to hell and off with you. So this is a biblical theme. Christ or Jesus proclaimed as himself, the kingdom is coming and some of you will be judged. So if we just put it in a larger biblical context or a larger context of the history of Christianity, there's nothing unusual about proclaiming God is both merciful and judging and so forth. So if we put it in a broader context, this kind of revulsion against tyranny or revulsion against too much power, or to put it another way around, this turn toward humanitarianism, where we're sympathetic toward people who are suffering and in need, which is a great 19th century movement. That affected how Calvinism was understood. In terms of when we come to what the ministers said from the pulpit in New England in the 17th century, now they would have happily said that they felt a loyalty to the Calvinist tradition. But if we ask what they said from the pulpit, what they actually said to people in the pulpit, they said, think of all of you should think of yourself as among the saved, because we don't know. It's a mystery. That's actually part of the doctrine that nobody knows except God. So think of yourselves among the saved, and I'm preaching to give you the hope that you are among the saved. So the practical workings of this doctrine were completely opposite to what we think they might be. Someone asked me once, did people ever assume that their children were damned? Some of their children, he had 5 children, 3 of them elect, 2 of them damned. And I said, absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible to think that. And you can't find a gravestone in New England for the 17th century that says, oh gosh, sorry, whoops. So the practical workings of this doctrine are toward a kind of universalism, a kind of practical universalism. There's still hypocrites. You still have to kind of wrestle with this notion of, are you really sincere? But the practical workings are not gloomy at all. And as far as the black goes, which there are a surprising number of portraits painted toward the end of the 17th century. And these are the most gaudily dressed people imaginable. And they're wearing reds, and oranges, and greens. And the notion of black goes back to one specific fact, and that is that the ministers wore the black scholar's gown, which was a way of getting away from the dress of the priests of the Catholic Church, which are, of course, multicolored in various ways. That's the only kind of garment that was black. No other garment was black. And so you can say metaphorically, they're kind of gloomy, okay, if you want to. But in terms of literal dress, they wore the full, they're Elizabethans. They wear the full panoply of clothes that the Elizabethans wore.
And they knew how to have fun.
And they knew how to have fun.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another question that I hear a lot in the library is about the role of the Congregational churches in establishing American democracy, which is kind of an idea that's been around for a long time. And I'd really love to know what you think about that idea, or how you would respond to that.
Yes, it is around. It has been around for a long time. So here's what we can say without any doubt. That the colonists brought with them a very, very strong assumption that there cannot be arbitrary power, and it has to be held in check by some means, of checks and balances kind of idea. The second very, very strong rule they have, Thomas Hooker says this in Connecticut in 1638 in a famous sermon, is that the people can set the bounds of the office of those in office. And this is, again, exactly contrary to what the kings of England are arguing. What does this mean? That the ruler's sense of office is limited by what the people want to delegate, but it's implicitly a theory of popular sovereignty. Namely, the real power rests with the people who then assign it or transmit it, pass it on to. And Congregationalism has exactly the same notion, that the ministers owe their power. They have nothing. There's no such thing as a kind of standing ministry until the congregation elects them to office. And there's actually a curious word which doubles word. It's called ministerial power. It sounds like of the ministry. It's actually a kind of power. It's a subordinate kind of power, a lesser kind of power. I should say a fourth is accountability. It's very, very interesting that when the colonists come over, the question is, can you turn a ruler out of office? And Winthrop was turned out of office in 1634. Bang, right there. You establish a rule of accountability. And when the people in Connecticut found their government, no governor can serve more than a single-year term. But it's quite remarkable that this early on and this explicitly, they lay out this set of parameters for good government. Now, of course, they're wrestling with, will good government prevail, what we do today?
So it's really consent of the governed.
It's consent of the government. Consent of the government is, there's no legitimacy to government without the consent of the government. That's right.
Yes, and that's a deeply congregational idea.
Right. And actually it's striking because when Winthrop came over, if you just take the very beginnings of Massachusetts, and it's again a small point. So there are only 9 people who have political power in the fall of 1630, and that's because they were the shareholders of the officers of the Massachusetts Bay Company. And Winthrop and his friends say, wait a minute, something is wrong here. It's not going to work. And they admit 116 men to the same privileges as the shareholders have. They become voters. And that goes right back to this point. They would have no legitimacy unless they broadened the base of their connections to the people. And from there on, you just have, things just begin to unfold in that manner.
I have one last question, and of course we could talk about this all day, but I'm a member of the First Church in Cambridge, and the last chapter of your book is a beautifully rendered portrait of this church. And I am just wondering, when you researched this material on First Church in Cambridge, was there anything that surprised you, that might surprise someone who doesn't know all that much about Puritanism?
It is a surprising history, and it's surprising. I say the first surprise is the strong mutuality, the strong ethical principle that you care for each other, and it's so specifically historical in the records because people had a hard time coming over here. They lost. They ran into poverty. The resources were scant. And I quote Thomas Shepard very specifically saying to the congregation in 1638 in his sermons, we can't let anybody be ignored in our community, and we have to do something about it. And then they set up a fund, which the deacons administer, and then all these legacies to the fund from people, wealthy people, middling people, to create a kind of pool of resources to then distribute around to people in need. So the imperative to take care of everyone. And then something I stumbled on, which was that the men and women of this church called each other brother and sister, so that the rankings, this is a hierarchical society in some ways, all the kind of rankings disappear. So that Dunster, who's the president of Harvard, is calling a woman, a very, very ordinary woman who's so poor she needs to get a liquor license so she can make some money. He's calling her sister. And again, that's an emblem of togetherness, of community. It's also an emblem of set apart because that's a language which is unique to the church community and not something in the street you would just say to anybody you pass. So then the third thing was the question that I was really driven to write and to explore when I began this essay. The question was the church really an exclusive place? And that would have been a very easy thing to say given some of the assumptions about Calvinism and arrogance of Calvinism and arrogance of the Puritans and so forth and so on. And it might have happened. I mean, the records are always incomplete. There may have been people who did that. But the extraordinary thing is how open the doors of the church were and how Shepard welcomed into the church all kinds of people. And then, for various reasons, I became interested in the sacrament of baptism. And you face a choice with baptism. Whom do you baptize? You're a Baptist who doesn't play based on people who are adults, or you infants or not. And it's fascinating to watch this church work through the question of baptism well beyond the period that I covered in this book. And basically it opts for an ever-widening possibilities for children being baptized. So children pour into the church in remarkable numbers. And then, of course, once they're in. You don't get chased out. Once you're baptized, you are actually a member of the church. That's often forgotten. The children become real members of the church and stay that way as adults. So rather than it being a kind of tight, narrow, all the prejudicial words you could think of to say about these people, none of them matched up to what actually happened in Cambridge, either in terms of the church's internal ethics of the leveling of the field and opening up charity for people, or in terms of its relationship to the town. So I was a little surprised myself how these practices unfolded so clearly and so explicitly. So it's not surprising that religion or religious practice or congregationalism comes in various keys, right, or various tones, right? That's usually what things are in life. So that could please me to fill in more elaborate, more nuanced portrait of this community, and happily the records are there to do this.